Alright everyone, we are going to talk a bit more about Chapter 2. I know we covered enzymes last week in lab, so I'm not going to take a massive amount of time to cover those this week, but I do want to talk about other biochemical stuff that's going on. You do not need to be a chemist here. That is not the main focus of this topic. It is how do these chemical interactions impact a lot of things in our body. But I do want to give some kind of basic background because I know not everybody has had a chemistry class before, so I kind of want to make sure that we're all starting off on the same page. So, this is focused on Chapter 2. This is going to be broken up into multiple videos. So we are going to start off talking mostly about molecules and bonds after we cover some very, very, very basic chemistry information. So, just basic terminology to start off with. Chemistry is the study of composition, structure, and change in matter. Matter is anything that occupies space and has mass. So when you take a chemistry class, if you haven't already, you will go into a lot more detail about that, but just so that you kind of know what we're talking about, we're just talking about composition, structure, and change in anything that has mass and takes up space. An atom is the basic unit of a chemical element. It has three types of particles: protons, electrons, and neutrons. The number of protons is what determines what element that represents. Protons have a positive charge to them, electrons have a negative charge, and float around in kind of this cloud-like area outside of where the protons and neutrons are located, and neutrons have a neutral charge. They are not positive or negative. So protons and neutrons together sit in the nucleus of an atom. This is different from the nucleus of a cell. Similar idea, it's kind of that central part, but structurally and functionally speaking, they are very different. They just have the same name. But nucleus contains protons and neutrons of an atom, and the electrons are in a cloud surrounding that. An element is a pure form of matter that contains only one type of atom. So every single atom that makes up that matter has the exact same number of protons, so it's the exact same element. There are roughly 118 elements total. There are some others that can be created by humans for very brief periods of time. Again, that's very chemistry based, so we're not going to focus too much on that. About 90 of these elements are found naturally and are stable so that we can ID them. Some of these other elements are not very, very stable, so they just don't exist for very long. And roughly 25 of these are found in the human body. We are made up mostly of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen with a few other things in there. So, again, about 25 of these are required for life. 99% of our body mass is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus. Alright, this is not potassium. Potassium's letter is K, actually. This is Latin-based. I don't remember off the top of my head what that was, but I do know it's Latin-based. The remaining 1% of our body mass includes things like potassium, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, magnesium, and some other trace elements that are very important for our function. Like potassium and sodium are absolutely essential for our body to maintain water balance and not get dehydrated or take on too much water. Magnesium is really, really essential for our muscle function and nerve function, among other things. So, even though they make up a very small percentage of our body mass, they are very important. Okay, so moving on with some terminology, molecules. This is when two or more atoms combine to form a new chemical substance. These are held together by chemical bonds that we'll talk about here in a little bit. An example would be O2. This is oxygen gas. This is just two molecules of oxygen that have bonded together. Just so you're kind of aware, for molecules, the symbol for each element, so their letter symbol, and in subscript, so this little kind of drop down number is how many atoms of that element are in the molecule. So this is oxygen. It's a colorless gas. It is one of the most reactive of non-metallic elements. This is not really something you need to know. Oxygen gas is important for us in small quantities, not as much as you'd think that we'd need. But molecules do not necessarily have to be made of all the same element. All right? We're going to come back to that in just a moment, so just kind of a refresher. So remember, atoms have protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons and neutrons give us the atomic mass. We'll talk a bit more about isotopes later, and the electrons are really important for the formation of bonds, any type of bond that we'll talk about here in a little bit. And when we combine two or more atoms to share electrons, they form a molecule. A compound is basically a subtype of a molecule that is specifically made up of two or more different elements, making a brand new chemical substance. And we see these a lot. One of my favorite examples is sodium chloride. Sodium's symbol is Na, chlorine's symbol is Cl. So sodium, in its pure state, if we just had a sodium molecule in its pure state, it is a silvery metal that actually explodes on contact with water. Not safe for our body. Chlorine, in its pure state, is a very, very deadly yellow gas. It's been used in both world wars and a lot of other wars throughout human history, unfortunately. Again, not good for the body. But when we combine these two elements together and form sodium chloride, this is table salt, which we actually need. We need the ion forms of both sodium and chloride in our body for it to function properly. And we'll talk more about ions later in lectures this week. But this just goes to show that just because something is toxic in its natural state does not mean it is always toxic when it's bonded to other types of elements. And we see this a lot in the biological world. So all compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds, because molecules can be either a combination of atoms from just one element that have bonded together, like oxygen gas, O2, or they can be two or more elements together. It's kind of like saying all thumbs are fingers, but not all of our fingers are thumbs. Is kind of how I like to think about that. And just to kind of let you know, so basically, remember I said with oxygen we had the O and then the subscript 2 because there's two of those atoms. For this particular compound, we only have one atom of each. So generally speaking, when we write these out, if there's only one atom, we don't put that subscript. So this is just one atom of sodium combined with one atom of chlorine. All right. So I want to talk a bit more about these electrons. And you do not need to know valence shell for this particular class. You will for chemistry. But this is where the electrons that are furthest away from the nucleus of the atom are located, because the electrons actually sit in these basically shells. So they don't just kind of float around in this cloud at random. They have these orbits that they travel around the nucleus, and each orbit, each energy level, can only hold a certain number of electrons. So the first one, the closest one to the nucleus, can only hold 2 electrons. The next one out can hold 8 electrons, the next one can hold 18, and then 32, and this can keep going depending on how large the atom is. But the outermost one, whichever is furthest out, is called the valence shell. And this is what determines how likely that atom is to form a chemical bond. So this kind of comes in really important when we get into biochemistry. All right. So, Electrons have some very important biological roles. They can form something called a covalent bond. They can form an ion. They can function as high energy electrons, and they can be something called a free radical. You've probably heard this floating around in some influencers' spiel on why you need to buy their supplement to take care of free radicals. Don't buy the supplement. I'm going to try not to get on a soapbox there. Don't buy supplements from influencers, please. They are not tested. Anywho, we will talk about what free radicals are and why they are concerning, and why so many influencers like to use them for fear-mongering. Alright, so again, those valence electrons, that's usually all we pay attention to when we're talking about bonds. So here we have an oxygen atom and 2 hydrogen atoms. You can probably already figure out what this particular compound is going to be. This is water. H2O, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. So because that outer shell of electrons in the oxygen and in the hydrogen, they do not have the maximum number of electrons that could possibly be in that shell, which means they're pretty reactive. They want to find more electrons to form a bond so that they are more stable. All right, that's what I mean by this determines the reactivity. So this outermost valence shell here, 32, if there are only 28 electrons in there, when it can hold a max of 32, that's going to make it much more reactive and more likely to form a bond. So hydrogen and oxygen are pretty reactive because they are not stable in that outer shell of electrons, so they want to find electrons to fill up that shell and become a lot more stable. And hydrogen and oxygen like to bond together a lot because when we bind 2 hydrogens to a single oxygen atom, that gives oxygen 8 electrons in its valence shell, which is what it wants, and it gives each hydrogen atom 2 valence electrons, which is what it wants. All right, again, you'll go into a lot more detail in chemistry, so I'm not going to go into too much depth here, but that's how we can determine how likely something is to react. So water becomes a very, very, very stable molecule, very stable compound, because now all of the atoms involved have the number of electrons they want in that outer shell, and they are very, very happy. They don't really want to break apart now. This is why boiling water takes a fair amount of energy. Converting this from a liquid molecule into vapor takes a lot of energy. We have to heat that up significantly to force these bonds to break now that they've stabilized. Alright, so we're going to talk about some of these different types of bonds. The first is a covalent bond, and that's what we just saw with water. These are very strong bonds that require energy to create them and to break them. Like I was mentioning, we have to boil water for a while at very high temperatures to get it to turn from a liquid into a vapor to break those bonds. This is a shared pair of electrons. This can be single, double, or triple. So atoms can share 1 pair of electrons, they can share 2 pairs of electrons, and they can share 3 pairs of electrons to make a single, double, or triple bond. And we have both polar and non-polar forms of these covalent bonds based on how equally shared those electrons are, because they are not always equally shared between the atoms involved. So, covalent bond, this is attraction force holding together 2 non-metal atoms, sharing that pair of electrons. In a polar covalent bond, electrons are shared unequally. So other polar things, think about magnets. So if you put the wrong side of a magnet, 2 magnets toward each other, they'll repel each other, so there's kind of an unequal attraction on each side. Similar idea here. So when these atoms combine together and start sharing those electrons, basically, the electrons are more attracted to one of the nuclei, one of the atomic nuclei, than they are to the other one. And that's based a lot on how many protons are in there, those positively charged ones. So this gives us unequal sharing of those electrons. And then we have nonpolar covalent bonds where the electrons are shared equally between the different atoms. All right, so this is what we saw a bit more represented with the water, although water is a bit more tricky, which we'll talk more about. Water is a very, very, very unique substance. But again, remember, covalent bonds in general are very, very strong. It doesn't matter if they're polar or nonpolar. They are going to require a lot of energy to break them. And the more bonds you have, the more sets of electrons you have, the stronger the bond is. So this is just another way of looking at nonpolar and polar covalent bonds. So nonpolar have an even distribution of electrons, so it gets shared equally, and polar molecules end up having partially charged positive and negative regions, and we do see that with water. Water is a polar molecule. It's not always represented that way in every single drawing, but it is a polar molecule, and that is really important for a lot of biological interactions that we see. All right, so basically, the electrons are more attracted to oxygen because it has more protons in its nucleus than hydrogen does. All right, so it gets a slight negative charge, whereas the hydrogens get slight positive charges to them. All right. And because you're going to see this a lot, I just kind of want to give you an example of how we draw a lot of molecules. There are different ways of representing molecules, but these line drawings are some of the more common ones. Anytime you see a straight line, that is a covalent bond. It's not necessarily going to tell you if it's polar or nonpolar, but that is a covalent bond. So one line is one covalent bond, 2 lines would be a double bond, 3 would be a triple bond, so on and so forth. There are other types of line drawings to represent other types of interactions that we'll kind of see as we go through some of these topics. All right. Now, let's get into how this impacts us biologically. So, organic molecules, what we're made up of, contain a lot of carbon. We are a massive amount of carbon. Biomolecules are the term for these molecules. They can also be called biological macromolecules or just macromolecules, so some different terms for that. These are organic molecules, so these are carbon-based. They are made up of very small repeating molecular units linked in a chain. These are called polymers, so that prefix poly means many, and each of these units is called a monomer, so mono means one. We have 4 major groups of biomolecules that you've probably heard of already: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleotides or nucleic acids. Most of these contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and in a couple cases, some other atoms, some other elements. And the basic functions of these are to provide energy for our body and as building blocks for various structures. So biomolecules do not have to be purely one type of molecule, so we can actually start combining different types of biomolecules together. So we can conjugate proteins, so this is a protein combined with some other type of biomolecule, so a lipoprotein. This is a protein that transports lipids, so they can bind to these lipid molecules. Glycosylated molecules are attached to carbohydrates, so glycoproteins and glycolipids are found in cell membranes, and again, those biomolecules are polymers. So here is an example of these different classes of biomolecules that we have and the different combinations that we can get. So proteins, this is a series of amino acids linked together to form a protein. Carbohydrates are made of monosaccharides. If we combine two monosaccharides together, we have a disaccharide, and anything where there are two or more monosaccharides linked together, that is a polysaccharide. That's where we get into those complex carbs, is what they're commonly referred to as. So these can be glycogen. That's a storage, energy storage system that our body uses. Starch is a similar idea, but in plants. And cellulose is used as fiber for our bodies, but it also gives plants structural support. Lipids, the basic units are glycerol and fatty acids. So we can have monoglycerides, diglycerides, and triglycerides. And these can get even larger. And we'll get into a bit more detail with these later. So other lipid-related molecules that are going to be really important. Phospholipids, this is what is making up our cell membrane. These are really, really important. You're going to hear a lot about phospholipids. Eicosanoids and steroids. I know everybody has a bad association with steroids because of anabolic steroid use in a lot of athletes. But steroids are essential for our body to function. This is a lot of our hormones, testosterone, progesterone, estrogens. Those are all steroid hormones in our body. So we do need steroids, just not the artificial type. And then nucleotides, this is our DNA and RNA, also making up our energy sources like ATP. And then there are some other structures that use these nucleic acids. I want to talk a little bit about functional groups because you'll see those referenced. These are combinations of elements that occur very frequently in biological molecules, and they can move in between molecules as a single unit. So some of the very common functional groups that we see are amino groups. This is nitrogen linked to two hydrogen atoms. We see these on proteins a lot. This is a classic protein functional group. A carboxyl group or carboxyl acid. This is a carbon, two oxygens, and a hydrogen. The oxygens, we don't have an O2 here because the oxygens are not bound to each other. As you can see over here with our line drawing, a carbon has a double bond to one of the oxygens and then a single bond to the other oxygen, which is also bound to a hydrogen. So that's why it's not CO2H, right? A hydroxyl group is just oxygen and hydrogen. Phosphate groups we see a lot with our energy sources. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate. There are 3 of these functional groups linked onto ATP, and breaking those phosphate groups off is what helps give us energy. We'll talk more about that next week with cellular respiration. But this is 2 hydrogens, a phosphate molecule, and 4 oxygens. All right, so we've kind of already covered these covalent bonds. So again, one of those roles that electrons have. And now I want to talk about ions. And very briefly about isotopes. So if we look at a hydrogen atom, this is our most basic atomic unit. There's 1 proton, 1 neutron, and 1 electron. All right, so if the hydrogen atom gains a neutron, it becomes an isotope. We have not changed the number of protons, and we have not changed the number of electrons. We've only changed the number of neutrons, which, remember, have a neutral charge. So this does not change the charge. It does change the mass of this atom, though. This is really important when we look at radioactive substances. So many of these isotopes of various elements, not necessarily every isotope of every element is radioactive, but that is very, very, very common. Whereas if we change the structure here by losing an electron, that creates an ion. And sodium ions, like I mentioned earlier, and chloride ions are really essential for our body to function. a lot of those substances, those electrolytes, function as ions in our body. So they are going to have a positive or negative charge to them. All right. So if an atom loses an electron, so we've taken away a negatively charged particle, now the entire atom has a positive charge to it, so this is H+. If we were to gain an electron, this would be a negatively charged ion. So here are some very important ions in the body. So positively charged ions are called cations. Negatively charged ones are called anions. So our cations are sodium, potassium, calcium, which actually ends up with a double positive charge, as does magnesium, and then hydrogen. And our anions are chloride, bicarbonate, phosphate, and sulfate. So this isn't necessarily always going to be just a single atom. Sometimes it is going to be a functional group. So bicarbonate, this is really important for acid balance in our bloodstream. All right, so again, ions charged, cations lost electrons. Remember, electrons have a negative charge, which makes the atom more positive, and anions gain electrons, so they are negatively charged because now they have more of those electrons. And because of this positive-negative charge, we can actually get ionic bonds. So this is what's called an electrostatic attraction. It's just positive and negative charges being attracted to each other due to that gain or loss of electron. So opposites attract here, similar to magnets. Hydrogen bonds are the other thing I'm going to talk about right now before I end this video. We're going to talk about van der Waals forces later on when we talk about proteins, because we really see those mostly in proteins. But hydrogen bonds and ionic bonds are pretty weak. They don't require a lot of energy to create them or break these bonds. So ionic bonds, I'll show you an example here in just a moment. And then hydrogen bonds, attraction between a hydrogen atom and nearby oxygen, nitrogen, or fluoride atom. This is how we get water surface tension. So this is how things, usually very light things, if you set them on the surface of water very gently, they will float on that water because of this tension created by hydrogen bonds between the different water molecules. So ionic bonds, electrons are transferred between atoms rather than sharing them. All right, so remember covalent bonds, the electrons are shared. That's what makes them so strong. All right, these are pretty strong too, not as strong as covalent bonds, but they are pretty strong. Positives and negatives can be very, very attractive to each other. So these stay close together, these atoms, but they are not directly linked. So this is really essential for a lot of electrolytes in our body. And then hydrogen bonds form when hydrogen atom that has a polar covalent bond to a very negatively charged atom is attracted to lone electrons on another polar covalent molecule. We see this with water. Again, remember those polar covalent bonds result in slight positive or negative charges on the atoms. And so we can still get that positive-negative attraction. This is the weakest of these three bonds. So our water molecules, here's one right here. Oxygen has a slight negative charge. Hydrogens will have slight positive charges. So all of these hydrogen atoms are attracted to oxygen atoms on other water molecules. And that's what gives us that surface tension. Another place we see hydrogen bonds is in our DNA. So each strand of DNA is held close to the other strand through a hydrogen bond. This is important because we have to break these bonds apart when we replicate the DNA, because we only replicate one strand at a time. We don't copy down both of these. They each get copied separately on their own, so we need to keep them close to each other, but still have them easily broken apart for replication, because we replicate our DNA pretty frequently. And here's just another visual representation, if this is a little bit better for you, of ionic versus hydrogen bonds. So here we have sodium chloride. So sodium here is going to give up an electron to chlorine, and that is going to give sodium a slight positive charge. Chlorine is going to have a slight negative charge in their ionic forms. So they tend to stay pretty close to each other, but they can be split apart with a little bit more ease than if they were actually sharing those electrons. And then hydrogen bonds, again, very commonly formed between water molecules. This is how we can get water drops because of the surface tension, but it's also pretty easy to break. It doesn't take a whole lot to break this apart. All right. I'm going to cut this video here, and we are going to focus more on these non-covalent interactions in the next video.